The Royal Flying Doctor Service is an iconic, much-loved and our most trusted Australian charity. The Flying Doctor operates in the most remote corners of our vast country, and certainly here in Western Australia, we couldn't do without it. Today, around my warm table, you're going to meet a real Flying Doctor. A friend and former colleague of mine from a few years ago when I had the privilege of working for WA's RFDS. I have a tremendous admiration for the doctors, pilots and nurses that work for this vital regional health service. But before I introduce you to our Flying Doctor, I want to share some stats and information about the service that you may not realise, and I certainly didn't know until I worked there. In WA, the Flying Doctor is an essential service because our state is the world's largest and most remote health jurisdiction, covering 2.5 million square kilometres of sparsely populated and harsh terrain. And did you know that the RFDS has 5 strategically positioned aeromedical bases throughout WA, and that it has 16 PC-12 aircraft, 3 jets and now 2 helicopters, which are all fitted out like emergency hospital units in the sky. They're incredible if you ever get a look inside one. It's important to know that the RFDS doesn't just swoop in to save people in emergencies, but it also brings GP clinics, the dentist, the pharmacy, and dedicated, highly skilled professionals to patients in the most remote places when they need it the most. And if you think the Flying Doctor is only for our regional friends, then think again, because the moment you leave the metro area and travel around our beautiful state, you're in Flying Doctor country, and you too might need their service. In fact, last year in WA alone, the Flying Doctor flew 9 million kilometres, conducted 16,000 landings and retrieved more than 10,000 patients, as well as answering more than 50,000 consultation calls and treating another 10,000 patients at their primary health GP clinics in remote WA. Leading these medical teams is the insightful and very wise Dr. Kieran Hennelly, and it's my privilege to have him as our guest around my warm table today. He's going to share with us his journey to becoming a Flying Doctor and his deep connection with and awe of our rugged Australian outback. I'm Sonia Nolan and you're on my warm table. Welcome, Kieran. It's so lovely to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's just such a pleasure. I've since I started my Warm Table podcast, I've wanted to engage yourself and certainly the story of the RFDS. So I'm really excited that you could make time to be with us today.
No, I'm delighted to be here.
Kieran, I'd like to start with going back into your time in England because you're not Australian, you're not Western Australian,
No.
But gosh, you've seen probably a lot more of Western Australia than most people have. But tell us the road to coming here and your early days in England.
Okay, so that's a pretty circuitous journey. Yeah, born in the UK, born in Manchester, but of Irish parents. So my parents moved over from the west coast of Ireland probably in the 1950s. I'm the youngest of 5, and I was born quite a long time ago now in Manchester. Grew up there, went to school there, went to college in London, worked as a hospital doctor for about 8 years, then moved to New Zealand. Became, after a number of years, became a New Zealand citizen. That's sort of circuitously how I ended up here. I was settling into life as I guess you'd say, a rural general practitioner in the South Island of New Zealand in a ski town.
Sounds quite picturesque.
A town called Wanaka, which some of
beautiful.
you... Yeah,
I've been
well,
there.
there you go. Yeah.
It is a postcard.
It's kind of ridiculously beautiful, really.
It is. That's a good way to describe it.
And a lot of the people felt I kind of needed my head examining when I suggested I was going to leave that and go and work in the Kimberley.
In the rugged Kimberley.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I needed something. I needed shaking up. So I had an opportunity and I took it. And it was a real punt, actually. I didn't know how it was going to turn out at all. Signed on for 12 months, and that was 11 years ago.
Oh, so it's obviously worked out. I want to go back a step though, Kieran, because you did mention to me once that medicine wasn't necessarily going to be your path. You hadn't intended to be a doctor.
No, I hadn't.
So
I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I was kind of reasonably bookish as a child, and I actually ended up getting a place to do philosophy, politics and economics. So I had a scholarship into one of the universities in the UK, and can still remember very clearly just being a bit concerned about the direction it was taking me in. And this is going to sound kind of insufferably intellectual, but I remember having a conversation when I was having my interview for university to do philosophy, and they were asking me kind of questions about what I thought was relevant in philosophy. And I was talking about action and being present in the world and doing things. And I think from an early age, I had a strong sense that I wanted to leave the world changed. I was unafraid of kind of jumping in, much more afraid of being a passive observer on the sidelines. Got to thinking about that once I'd got my place to do philosophy and thought, well, maybe I should actually walk the walk. So it was a fairly late conversion to medicine, but it was that desire, which I think actually a lot of people have in their younger lives, to do something concrete to make the world a better place. And I thought, well, let's give it a crack. Actually never thought I would stay in medicine, but 30 years later, I'm still here.
You're still here, but you've done so many different things within that. What kind of medicine, what specialty did you specialise in?
I've been a bit of a wandering soul on that one, but I started as a surgeon. So I was qualified in 1992 in London, and I did basic surgical training. So I got my fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons in the UK in 1997. And I was then going on, that's just really an entry-level exam for higher surgical training. Did another couple of years after that doing cardiothoracic surgery.
Cardiothoracics, just for the uninitiated, is heart and lungs?
Yes.
Thank you.
So open heart surgery, basically. Yeah. But it was a complex decision about whether or not to stay. But I think in the end, there were other things I wanted to do with my life. I did love the surgery. I loved the immediacy and the importance of the role, but again, I have a memory of being on a ward round one day and staring out the window at the rest of the world, and my peers tended to be very focused, and that was really that they'd had that as their goal really for all of their adult lives. And I made a decision, which I still miss surgery. I don't miss the fact that I haven't spent the last 30 years of my life in the same hospital, which is still a bit of a vocation, that stuff. And I have nothing but respect and admiration and regard for my peers who did stay in that world. And I've always got a soft spot for surgeons, which a lot of people find them, a little bit of sometimes challenging in some of their behaviours. But I'll always have love and regard for practice of surgery.
Look, I think I remember you saying to me one evening, Kieran, as we were working, that you need to be a special type of person to be a surgeon because, look, you're actually cutting somebody open. So you actually have to have complete confidence and faith in your abilities. And there's a special type of person that can do that.
Yeah, I believe that very strongly. It's not easy.
It's not for the faint-hearted.
No. And it challenges your sense of self-belief, and it is a very strong leadership role. I mean, I remember very clearly, because I did 7 or 8 years of it. Although I was only at a junior trainee level, I can very clearly remember being in theatre, doing operations, and having the whole of the operating theatre staring at me, thinking, what's he going to do now if things were not, necessarily going as you would want them to, or the time of the surgery was extending. You've got to be tough.
Yeah. Well, look, all of that surely was great training for then working for the Royal Flying Doctor Service because of the emergencies and the situations that you find yourself in day to day.
Yeah, it was. What I haven't said is there were other aspects to that training. So a lot of surgeons do a lot of emergency medicine work. There's a big overlap there. So I did probably, if you added it all together, probably about 3.5 years in emergency. I did some critical care work. So I worked in an intensive care unit and did a couple of years of working on the high dependency unit with cardiothoracic patients after their heart surgery. As part of cardiac surgery, you get the heart to stop. You cool the patient down to 32 degrees and then you have to start them up again. So they're pretty sick when they come out of surgery. So I got quite comfortable working in environments where people were very unwell and you had to act decisively and with the best information that you have in front of you. So I learned a lot in that time in my life. I then moved away from that a little bit by actually going into rural general practice.
Was that in New Zealand?
Yeah. Yeah, so I never did general practice in the UK. Moved to New Zealand, sort of had a year or two of picking up some casual work. I mean, that was an epiphany for me, was getting to New Zealand, getting into the outdoors. I'd been very much a urban creature up until that point, and skiing all the time, and bushwalking, hiking, kayaking, scuba diving, all of that sort of stuff, which is very easy and accessible in New Zealand. It's almost compulsory, really.
It is. Yes, it is compulsory.
And I just picked up casual work to sort of fund me through that time, and that's how I ended up in Wanaka, which is a ski town. I did a ski season there as a doctor, and that turned into 9 years of living and doing rural general practice, which I didn't think I would enjoy as much as I did. What I loved about it was the people. We dealt a lot with high country sheep farmers, outdoorsy people, mountaineers, rock climbers, guides. It's a rural farming community, and they're just great people. I've always liked people who are engaged with their environment and sort of informed by living and working in a landscape. You know, just something about that works well with the type of people that I respond to.
There's nothing more grounded and more landscape and picturesque than the Kimberley. But just before we go there, Kieran, you said you were a ski doctor for a while. Does that mean lots of broken limbs? Like, what are the main things that present to you as a ski doctor?
Yeah, so I never worked up the hill. Some of my peers actually went and worked on the ski field. I worked in town, but we would get everyone come down. So, you know, a big day in Wanaka. I mean, there's only 5,000 people live in Wanaka as a sort of resident population, but you could get 4,000 people up one of the ski fields, and there's 3 ski fields around there. So you could get a lot of quite unwell people, and it's all broken wrists, dislocated shoulders, broken legs, knee injuries, head injuries, lots of people banged up and stuff. Yeah.
Or the novice skiers. I remember being in Wanaka, and we arrived in the evening and set up our camper van. We did the camper van thing with the kids, and didn't appreciate the beauty of the place until we woke up in the morning, and it was just like, oh my goodness.
That's a good way to arrive in Wanaka.
It really was. It was just stunning. The next morning I was just breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. And yes, you're lucky that I wasn't one of those people that presented to you, because skiing is not my forte.
I was kind of enthusiastic but bad skiing, and I dinged myself a few times as well. Touch wood, never had any really horrendous injuries.
From Wanaka, you went to the Kimberley?
Pretty much, yeah. There was a bit of locum work in the middle. It took about, I think from memory, it took about 9 months to get all of my permissions and credentialing organised to come and work in Australia. There's often a lag for overseas trained doctors before they can come.
What attracted you to RFDS? Were you one of those little kids in the UK watching the RFDS series on television
Most
and
definitely.
thinking you were one of those?
Yeah. I still remember it, yeah, very clearly. It was difficult to describe really to Australians how impossibly exotic Australia seemed when you were growing up in quite a cold, grey, rainy Manchester, and we'd get this glimpse of this kind of technicolor world where everyone was tanned and gorgeous and had white teeth.
Oh yes, that's us. Yes.
Yeah. Just things like surfing and some of the aspects of, you know, I think that kind of beach life and again a life for a lot of Australians which is very tied up with the ocean and the coast is, you know, it seems amazingly exotic to someone from the UK. Yeah, absolutely watched the Flying Doctor series, the original one, I should say.
The new one's a bit risque, isn't it?
I haven't seen it.
I've only watched one episode.
Really admit that, should
I? You shouldn't. I know, I do believe it's quite risque, but you know, I think it does a really good representation of what does actually happen for most
probably
of
much
RFDS.
more exciting.
Much more exciting than your normal time in the aircraft. Yeah. So, watching that as a child, could you ever have imagined that would be you?
Not really, no. I never had a very good sense when I was young of what the future might look like. I do remember thinking what I would be like in the year 2000, you know, the
it
year
would have seemed so far away at that time.
It did, and all of a sudden it's in the past. You know, it's very strange how that happens. But one thing I did know was that I was restless and curious. And I probably have my family and my siblings to thank for that, in the sense that they were all older than me. All of them went to university before I did, and they'd started that exploration of the world. So I lived that vicariously through them, and just couldn't wait. Was desperate to get into it and get stuck in. And as it turns out, I'm probably the widest travelled and the most restless of my family, actually.
Are you the most tanned?
That's a very low bar to. Yeah, I think I might be, though.
You might be.
I've got fairer hair than the rest of them, and I probably do go a slightly deeper shade of pink than.
There you go.
Than the rest of them. For your listeners, they may not know, but I am a redhead.
Yeah, I know. It
yeah.
was actually a low blow, wasn't it, Kieran? It was a pretty low blow. That must have been such a shock to you, landing in the Kimberley to work in confined places in some of the most remote, hard to reach regions. No aircon, no mod cons. Tell me what those first few months were like.
Yeah, I can remember. I only had the vaguest idea of where Derby was or what it might be when I agreed to go there for a year, and I think I'd looked it up on Google Earth, and you couldn't really tell that much. But landed there 1st of November 2011. I remember that very clearly. And it was extraordinary, it was just this blast of heat and just such a different environment, just vast expanses of nothing. I mean, for any of your listeners that have flown up from Perth to the Kimberley, you fly over the Great Sandy Desert, and that's just kind of dunes undulating away into the horizon for seemingly forever. And it felt amazingly and massively remote. And there's about a 35k drive into Derby from the airport that you then used to land at, which is Curtin. And there were dingoes on the road, and it was just this blazing heat and this bush it was like a sea, the bush there, it's like you're in a boat in the middle of a green ocean. Derby town, which I love and will always have great regard for, but it's not the prettiest town on the planet, hey? I think even its champions would admit that. So it was a bit of a culture shock.
I can imagine.
Getting there. First night, got invited out onto the marsh. They were having an arrival party for me and a departure party for a couple of the pilots who were leaving. We may have had a flyover from one of our aircraft. Ooh. And the marsh is just kilometres of baked dry mud, and sun was going down. It was pleasingly exotic.
It sounds so great. Special.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And that's been my thing, is seeing different things and seeing stuff and getting experiences that I'm endlessly curious about, how people sort of fit their lives together and make sense of their lives. So I was always, every time I used to take a long distance plane flight, I'd be looking out of the window, wondering what the people who I was flying over, what the shape of their lives were and who they were and how they made sense of all the good and the bad in their lives. And that's a pleasure for me that never goes away.
That's harking back to your days of, philosophy, and, clearly that's something that's very much within you.
I like people. I've been a doctor for 30 years now, and it's a great and a very rewarding profession, but like any profession, it becomes familiar and samey. The thing that keeps me energized with medicine is the people, really, that you meet. And as I say, the unlikely and unusual circumstances in which they find themselves, and it's always been an honour and a pleasure to be allowed to reach out to people in those circumstances. It's great.
Can you tell us some of the stories of living in the Kimberley and being one of the senior doctors for the Royal Flying Doctor Service in the Kimberley? What sort of situations did you find yourself in?
The days are quite long. It's usually a 12-hour shift, but you work from home. You will get a phone call, and that can be from a remote area nursing post. It can be from a hospital. It can be from someone with an unwell person, or it can be from the person themselves, and they'll describe the problem to you. You'll make a determination of what's going on, where they need to go to, how urgently they need to get there. And then you sort of wrap all of that up, send it back to our operations centre, and then if so required, you will jump on an aircraft and go and grab them. We use fixed-wing aircraft. There's a pilot, there's always a nurse, and about 70% of the time there's a doctor on board as well.
And with the nurses, something that's really special about flying doctor nurses is that they're all trained midwives, aren't they?
Until very recently, it was a prerequisite. We did relax that a little bit during COVID as a business continuity piece, and also to look at more flexible models of working. It's true to say that the vast majority of them currently would still be midwives, and they do deliver quite a lot of babies and assist a lot of women who are labouring or have antenatal issues.
And one of the reasons that the RFDS is so important in WA is because of the way that the hospital is structured. Our main hospitals are here in Perth, and the regional hospitals need people to be coming down to Perth, or you've got those serious retrievals where they need to go to the trauma centre. So 2.5 million kilometres of state, the world's largest health jurisdiction, and a few planes being the ambulance in the sky to make sure that the people stay safe.
Yeah, and less than 1 million population in that 2.5 million square kilometres outside of metro.
So they're really spread out.
Yeah, and the Kimberley, I think when I got there, I realised on my first day of work it was about the same size as the British Isles. That was my patch for being on call. But there's probably only about 40,000 people in the Kimberley. But extraordinarily high unmet health needs, particularly in the Indigenous population, but not exclusively. There's plenty of non-Indigenous people living and working remotely who struggle to access healthcare. So it's a non-trivial challenge to deliver healthcare, and I think part of that solution, which the government and the people of Western Australia have to find for themselves, is assisted with the flying doctors. And if we do anything, I think we help to stitch it all together a little bit. There absolutely are first-rate hospitals and clinics and healthcare, and a lot of very hard-working, very determined and very well-intentioned people working and delivering healthcare every day in extremely remote areas. But the truth is that most of our tertiary specialities are concentrated in Perth, and there are things that you can do in Perth that you can't do anywhere else in WA. So,
of course,
we facilitate that
in a really extraordinary way. I mean, the history going back of the RFDS, over 90 years, coming up to 100 years in not too long, and just filling that need in a very vast country.
Yeah, I'm a fan of John Flynn, who is our founder.
Who's on the $20 note.
Yes, he is.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by who he is. I think he's a really interesting character in that he thought of an idea in that sort of post-war period, early 1920s and late 19-teens, if that's a thing, which it'd be an audacious idea if someone came up with it now. Back then, I just think it's extraordinary to even think that you might be able to do something like that.
Put a doctor on a plane. I think they put a doctor on a camel at one point. There's some great photos I remember seeing.
I have no doubt.
There's a doctor on a camel, but he probably got there firstly by plane. But either way, it was incredibly innovative at the time, this idea about, getting medical care to the most remote areas of Australia. And it was actually underpinned by it was called an experiment, and it was underpinned by some money from the guy who developed the Hills hoist.
I did not know that.
There you go. But yeah, really fascinating history.
To do that with technology like aircraft, which had really only been around for just over a decade, advances in wireless telephony and communications, I guess is what we'd call it now.
Made a huge difference.
And medicine. It's a brilliantly audacious idea. If I'm ever feeling kind of unsure about the decisions I'm making, or sort of not terribly confident about whether or not we can achieve it, I just think back to that, and I'm like, whatever we do now it's orders of magnitude less than what John Flynn thought to do.
And the courage and the vision that was needed in those days. Yeah, that's so true.
I think I might be slightly romanticising it, but I suspect that was a large part of the development of Australia as a country, and that ability to forge into remote and challenging areas and create new kind of endeavours, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, it gives you that safety, that sort of peace of mind that you've got medical care when you need it, and especially for families going into the regions, a phone call away, literally.
You know, if you talk to the pastoralists out in the cattle stations, they're often our biggest champions, and they will say that even though they may have never actually needed to pick up the phone and use us, the fact that we exist is a source of great comfort to them.
So, Kieran, take us back again. So we were talking about your early days in the Kimberley, and can you tell us about any particular memories that really stand out, any particular retrievals, or just memories of you being this adventurous, curious spirit in a very different place from where you grew up in Manchester?
I used to live right next to the marsh in Derby, and you can actually drive out onto the marsh, and the airport's also next to the marsh, and it was about 12 k's away from where I was living. So if we got a call, I could actually just nip out onto the marsh, and you could just drive across this trackless expanse of marsh with a big rooster tail of dust behind you, heading into the airport, knowing that you'd be jumping on an aircraft. And it was just great, really. And then every day there would be something amazing to look out of the aircraft window. There is a lot of boredom in the aircraft. It's that kind of mixture of boredom and terror sometimes, but you spend a long time either getting to the patient where you need to do certain things in terms of preparing for the patient and a certain amount of work to do, but there are moments where you can just look out the window and you see this extraordinary territory. You see the most amazing sunrises and sunsets, and you get to see things that nobody else does, really. You'd be listening to the radio at night, and sometimes you could sort of follow the radio chatter, and there'll be a few kind of commercial aircraft going above you at 35,000 feet, but you were really the only thing in the air for hundreds of kilometres. And in the wet season, you'd be in and out through the thunderstorms and things, so they'd be firing off kind of on the horizon. A great pleasure of mine was to just watch the thunderstorms, and if it was quiet, I could put a little bit of music on my headphones and just stare in wonder and admiration at what nature could deliver. Nature's very present there, and nature's in charge, really. You just nip into and around things and hope that you don't get noticed by the big forces that you see at work in nature. It's fantastic.
Any other memories that you can share with us?
Night shifts are a strange one because they can be really confronting. You do a lot of night work and very tired, obviously. Flying off into the night when you don't know what you're going to can be really frightening. It can be quite a lonely job compared to a lot of medical jobs because there's really only you and the nurse. You can get some very unwell people, and you have to be capable of dealing with pretty much anything that's thrown at you, which is not the case these days in hospitals. That can be really confronting, but I can remember one time we got a call from a ranger who was at one of the stations at the Bungles, Penalulu National Park. And it was the middle of the night. It was dark, dark, dark. And then just as the sun started coming up, we came in over the Bungles, and
oh, wow.
There was a kind of kerosene flare pathway for us set out. The sun coming up over there, and we were all, we were tired, but it just really lifted our spirits, and sensational beauty.
The majesty of it all.
Yeah, and the isolation. We landed and picked the chap up, and he was okay, and toddled on home and went to bed.
One thing which really struck me many years ago when we were chatting, Kieran, is we talked about how it's such a pressured environment sometimes in the plane when you're dealing with an emergency case, and you've got to go into, fight or flight mode pretty quickly and save a life, like literally save a life, some very intense situations that you find yourself in. And I asked you once, how do you cope with that after you've finished your shift, and surely the adrenaline's all pumping and you're still going. And I remember you talked to me about the cyclical nature of, sort of the story reaching a natural conclusion while you're on shift. Yeah. Do you remember that conversation?
I thought you were going to say red wine.
No, well, I don't know. Maybe that's the natural conclusion at the end of the day.
No, I do remember saying that, and I think there's some truth to it. There's a little narrative arc each day.
Yeah,
I think that's really quite helpful because it's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. If I compare what we do in RFDS with, say, the life of a general practitioner, a GP might see 20, 30 people, possibly even more in a day. Most of them aren't particularly unwell, but there'll be a a cohort of those who are extremely unwell, and it may not be immediately apparent. They're juggling lots of different patients with lots of different reasons for coming to see a doctor, all sorts of test results, referrals. It's a much more diverse and sometimes a confusing environment. There's a cleanness to the RFDS work. Big day at RFDS would be dealing with, say, 8 to 10 flight referrals or consultations, and then flying 4 or 5 patients. That would be a big day at work.
For the Kimberley.
For anywhere, really.
For anywhere, yeah.
I guess the rhythm of the job is set by the constraints of the model of care delivery. So the aviation necessarily puts certain lag into how you deliver services during the day.
And they're just the retrievals is what you're talking about here. So, I mean, I think a lot of people have that impression that the RFDS just swoops in and takes you away. And sometimes it does.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it's such a diverse service with things like the GP clinics and the dental, work and the remote regional work that, it is so diverse. It's not just the swooping in.
No.
And when you do get on the plane, you really need to be on that plane.
Yeah. You don't tend to go just in case or just for the sake of it, because there are operational constraints. If you're on the aircraft, then you're not available somewhere else in the organisation. There's weight constraints, there's fuel constraints, there's time constraints to putting someone on an aircraft. So.
And the pilots go through all of that really quickly, don't they? And that's the other extraordinary part of it. Yeah. It's, obviously the medical practitioners, but the pilots, they go through all of the weather checks, go through all the fuel they're going to need, the weights that is important in a constrained time.
And very consequential decisions, flying at night. As I say, through the wet season, sometimes into, they have a phrase which is a black hole landing, so an airstrip which doesn't have any lights around it. They may have some LED lights which are solar activated. We sometimes use kerosene flares, and you can see when they're flying in, all you can see is a few lights, and there's no reference points or anything like that. It's a really challenging type of flying that they do. And if they get their decision making wrong, either in deciding when to go or what the weather's doing, or in whether or not they can land at a particular strip, that has consequences either way. If you do go, it has consequence. If you don't go, it has consequence. I do remember having not a disagreement, but a discussion with a pilot one night about a patient that I wanted to go and grab from a remote community, and I found myself saying, well, it's only a grade 1 cyclone, so
we'll be right. It's only a grade 1 cyclone.
Not unreasonably, he suggested that we just wait a little bit.
And I think it's the pilot that gets to make the call, isn't it, Kieran? Yeah. And that's really important because they know, they're in charge of the aircraft and they get to make the call. Yeah,
there are. Sadly, they're the masters of the aircraft. Although
it's not the doctors.
No, the doctors. Well, everyone in that aircraft thinks that they're the most important person there. So it can become a little bit of a dysfunctional family outing with a bit of squabbling going on. But it's usually reasonably good-natured.
Oh, look, and I think that, everyone in that aircraft is of the highest calibre. That was certainly my recollection of everybody there. Just incredible professionals working for the RFDS.
No, they're a good bunch.
Kieran, you've tasted so many flavours of life and humanity in so many different parts of the world. And I just wonder whether there's some philosophical truth that you've come to about humanity, diving back into your understanding and love of philosophy, but also your curiosity and your understanding of humanity, because you've seen them in the most vulnerable times.
Yeah.
What's the truth that you've found for yourself?
It's a great question. Err on the side of niceness, I think, err on the side of being prepared to make a bit of an idiot of yourself. And sometimes if you default to trust, you'll get it wrong sometimes. But I think the consequences of that are less than defaulting to suspicion, which is a natural imperative, for a lot of us. And one thing I do strongly believe, that I certainly think I've got a lot of things wrong in my life, but one thing I've got right, I think, quite a lot of the time, was keep my mouth shut and let people tell you what they think of the world. And you'd be surprised, eh? Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom out there in unexpected places as well. That's the gold, when you find wisdom in places you don't anticipate it.
Here you are in Perth, Western Australia now, many years later, and having lived an adventurous life of curiosity and contribution, which seems to be the two words that describe you so well, Kieran, that you've really given so much to Western Australia through your generous approach to medicine and your expertise that you've given to the Kimberley and the adventures that you've enjoyed along the way.
I'd say I've had back more than I've received. Quite serious about this, but by orders of magnitude, really. If you have a curiosity about them, I think people are very generous at explaining who they are and how they see the world. And I think that's a great privilege. And without wishing to get too deep into the weeds with philosophy, but I believe there are lessons. I believe that there is purpose, and I believe those voices are sometimes quite quiet. So it does you well to quiet your own inner voice sometimes. I don't think it's random.
Well, that means that meeting you, Kieran, some years ago when we worked together was not random.
Well, there you go.
It was an absolute delight to reconnect again today and have you on my podcast. So thank you for saying yes to come and share My Warm Table.
Well, thank you again, and it's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to My Warm Table with Sonia Nolan. In Italian, a tavola calda is a warm and welcoming table where you can share big ideas, friendship, laughter and life. So much happens around the kitchen table, and I wanted to amplify it here in this podcast. My aim is to feed your mind and soul through smart conversations with heart. No topic is off limits, but good table manners rule. I hope you'll join us each week as we set the table for my extraordinary guests who will let you feast on their deep knowledge, life experiences, and wise insights. Let's keep the conversation flowing. Please subscribe to the My Warm Table podcast and share it with your friends and networks. Perhaps if they're new to podcasting, take a moment to show them how to download and subscribe so they don't miss an episode either. I'd also love you to join our community on Facebook. You'll find the group at My Warm Table Podcast. Your support is very much appreciated so that together we can eat, think, and be merry.